We'll get going. So howdy, folks. Welcome to the February edition of Cattle Trails Showcase. I'm Ron Wilson, Poet Laureate. I'm glad to be your host. Happy Valentine's Day to all of you. We hope you love our program. The purpose of the Cattle Trails Showcase is to continually highlight the communities, historical elements, museums, and other attractions along the historic cattle trails. Lonnie Steben is our showcase chair. Cattle Trails Showcase was initiated 4 years ago by the International Chisholm Trail Association, now as a project of the Cattle Trails Consortium, which seeks to promote all the historic cattle trails, the Chisholm Trail, the Western Trail, also known as the Great Western Trail, Shawnee Trail, and the Goodnight Loving Trail. And speaking of the Shawnee Trail, and right on cue, oops, Dwayne, I see your screen sharing. I don't know that we need that. But speaking of the Shawnee Trail, today we're going to hear about one of the key communities along the Shawnee Trail. And Dwayne, you are screen sharing, so if you could stop your screen share, I'd appreciate it. The community that we're going to hear about today is really the first Cowtown in Kansas. And it's Baxter Springs in the very corner of the state. Mary Billington is director of the Baxter Springs Heritage Center Museum and the Route 66 Visitor Center in Baxter Springs. And we're anxious to hear about that. The museum also operates the Fort Blair Historic Site. So we're going to ask Mary to share her screen. But first, I think, Dwayne, we are looking at your screen now.
How do I get out of it?
There should be a stop share button. Let's see. If you move your mouse across the top, is there a way to stop share? Or let's see.
Idiot.
How about leave the call and come back in?
That's the other option.
Okay. I found something. Okay, now I'll leave and come back. Go ahead.
All right. Sorry about that. Okay, let's see. Now, there, I just stopped sharing anyway. But Mary, can you share your screen now? And there we go. Terrific. So Mary grew up in Oklahoma. She has family in Missouri. Now we claim her in the corner of Kansas, where she's director of this wonderful museum and been there since 2016. So Mary, yes. We're seeing the thumbnails on the left. If you can go to your full presentation mode.
Let's see. And nope, I don't want that.
I know down in the lower right corner by that slider button, there is an icon of a screen.
Looks like a wine glass.
Yeah. That tells you what Michael knows. So in the lower right corner, there's a percentage just above the date I'm looking at. And just to the left of that percentage, there's the slider button, and just to the left of that is the wine glass. Hit the wine glass if you can. Go on over to
so my thing is I've got this on dual screen, so I am. Let me see.
The wine glass just to the left of the slider button in the lower right. Right there.
There we go.
There we go. Very good. Thanks.
Okay. So let's get started. You guys have seen this background when I had it up on mine, just our front sign and everything. The Eastern Shawnee Cattle Trail, it was very unique. It utilized both what was known as the Texas Road, the Military Road, and the Military Road was created prior to Missouri becoming a state in 1821. We saw surveyors out looking for the best route into the Oklahoma Territory to create the military road. And it was, completed after Missouri became a state. And it ran from Leavenworth to Fort Scott to Fort Gibson in Oklahoma. And from there, it splintered off into three different directions. One was to Fort Smith in Arkansas. The other one was to New Orleans, which most people don't realize, that the military road went all the way down there. And then the third route went out towards a smaller fort in western Oklahoma. But immediately following the Civil War, Texas drovers started coming to Kansas, and the Eastern Shawnee Cattle Trail came to be. This is a view of Baxter Springs in 1871, a bird's eye view map. It shows how quickly Baxter Springs became a town after 1866. And we can see, come back here. In the top half here, which seems to be cut off, the stockyards was right in here that the drovers were coming to, and the railroad came all the way to the edge of Oklahoma. And they would pick up these cattle who had been grazing on these open plains and move them to market. Let's see, where are we? So Baxter Springs, like the guy said, we're in extreme southeast Kansas. I mean, it's 5 miles to the Missouri line going here, and then literally the south edge of Baxter Springs dips over the Oklahoma line. It really looks like Baxter Springs tried to escape Kansas, but they held on. So we had, like I said, the military road, as well as the Eastern Shawnee Cattle Trail, the Texas road. But in the modern era, we saw the Ozark Trail, Jefferson Highway, and Route 66 passing through here. And they just really created this rich history of travel, tourism, and, how to move things along through the area. One of the earliest settlers in the area was John Baxter. John Baxter moved to this area from Newton County, Missouri. He was a rather large man, very gifted musically, as were much of his family. And he recognized the importance of the military road coming through here. And he built a small homestead on the hillside above the springs that the town gets its name from. And the springs was a very high mineral content springs. Those early surveyors with the military, when they were building the road, they called it a Calubite Springs. The Osage Indians, who were native to this area prior to white man coming in here, they considered it highly sacred, and they considered it a part of their annual pilgrimage to the area. They would come through here. Chief Black Dog built a passage known as the Black Dog Trail that went west from Baxter Springs out towards Ark City in that area. And it was a trading trail so that he could, trade with other Native Americans in that part of the Kansas area. He was a rather large man, known for his prowess in hunting, and skilled very much so in that. But the Black Dog Trail was an amazing feat. It was rumored to have been 50 horses wide, that men on horseback could ride 50 across along this trail. And so it was the first known western moving trail out of Baxter Springs. And if you look on a modern day map, Highway 166 following out of Baxter Springs kind of echoes that trail moving west. So it was very much a very well-traveled area with the military, the Osage Indians, and John Baxter came here, set up a little homestead at a point in time that wasn't legal for him to be here. He moved into what was known as the neutral lands, and no one was supposed to be here, but he was. and he was highly used with these travelers up and down the military road. It became, we'll stop at Baxter's place by the springs, and that is how the etymology of Baxter Springs got its name. So Baxter's place. The neutral lands, which I just touched on, the neutral lands were created after Missouri became a state in 1821. There was a treaty created with the Osage that placed them on their first reservation, which was started on the south edge of what is now Cherokee, or the western edge of what is now Cherokee County, and following along the south edge of Kansas across the Kansas, Missouri, or Kansas, Oklahoma border, traveling west for a couple of counties now. The Osage were placed there. That was their first known reservation. But at that point in time, Missouri was a slave state. And by creating these neutral lands, which were all of what is now Cherokee County, all of now Crawford County, and about the first mile to 2 miles of Bourbon County, so stacked up right along the edge of the Missouri-Kansas border, the neutral lands were created, and no one could live there. But during the Cherokee removal into Oklahoma Territory with the Treaty of New Echota, there was the agreement between the U.S. government and the Cherokee Nation that they would have to buy their lands. They were paid to leave the Carolinas and Georgia, and they would have to buy their lands in the new territory. Well, part of their acquisition was these neutral lands, and they became the Cherokee neutral lands. So prior to the Cherokee acquisition, these neutral lands were a no man's land. No one was supposed to live here, even though John Baxter and several others did come here. They were illegal. Technically, they were squatters. And when the Cherokee acquired it, it became the Cherokee neutral lands. And then anyone of the Cherokee Nation could take up lands here, much like, the Homesteading Act. The Cherokee could just go in, and that was where they lived. An early settler of the area had acquisition lands, and during the actual creation of the military road, he did not want to sell his land. The military wanted to buy his land and create a fort site. His land encompassed an area where Shoal Creek, coming out of Missouri, configured with Spring River, and where that juxtaposition was, he owned this land there, a member of the Cherokee Nation, and he didn't want to sell. And the U.S. government, they went back and forth. They really wanted to build a fort site there. And if he'd have sold, there would have been a fort built there. But since he didn't sell, they looked further north, and hence the creation of Fort Scott. So if he'd have sold, we wouldn't have had Fort Scott as we know it now. We touched on this a little bit. White settlers began to settle the area very early, as soon as Kansas was organized as a territory. And, during the Civil War, it was very much pushed to open. But here's the thing. Even though there were many people pushing to open, this was an area that saw quite a bit of conflict and coming in and out of, the Oklahoma Territory. Most of us all know that the Cherokee Nation, the Creek, what is considered the 5 civilized tribes, all sided with the Confederacy, and most of them fought with the Confederacy. There were outliers of each of these nations that moved into Kansas or to Texas, away from the conflict zone. Oklahoma saw many battles. If most of you don't know that there were Battle of Round Mountain, Battle of Honey Springs, the 2 different battles of Cabin Creek. These were all active battles that saw many of the Union soldiers coming out of Fort Scott engaged in the Oklahoma Territory. So, Baxter Springs was an active portion with people moving through here during the Civil War, but they didn't stay because of the conflict. They were moving back, but they kept an eye on this area because, it was one of the few places in this area that had mountainous areas. This small corner of Baxter Springs, Kansas, essentially within a mile on the western side of Spring River as it comes through Kansas, is the edge of the Ozarks Plateau, and it saw a very different alignment than much of Kansas. I mean, immediately leaving Baxter Springs, you notice that you're on the Great Plains of Kansas. And so this area was very much coveted because of the waterways, the abundance of springs, and the fact that it was a much greener area than a lot of places were. You know, after the Civil War, the Cherokee Nation, as part of their acceptance of going back to their original treaty with the U.S. government, they ceded the lands known as the Cherokee Neutral Lands, and this area officially became part of the state of Baxter, the state of Kansas, with Baxter Springs quickly forming on that. It's important to note that even though Kansas became a state in 1961, technically this was Indian territory here, and that on maps and such, this Cherokee Neutral Lands is listed as Indian territory. So technically they weren't part of the state of Kansas. So during the treaty in 1966, this portion actually became officially part of the state of Kansas, and the different counties were formed with Crawford, named after an early governor, Cherokee after the Cherokee Nation that ceded it over. So it was a very much, as it's stated here, a transition period after the Civil War, with people flocking to this area thinking they could homestead, but understanding that the Cherokee Nation didn't just give up the property here. They did cede it back, but it was with the agreement that it would be sold on their behalf. Well, the gentleman, John Joy, who was the current management of the local railroad, trying to get a railroad into Baxter Springs, was created as the land agent. Well, many of these early settlers to the area were suddenly being forced to pay for their land, didn't like it. It created a huge conflict in the area, and they sent National Guard troops down. The governor at the time did, and it was very much a huge conflict, because when land in the area is going for $1 to $2 an acre, and he's selling it for more than $7 an acre, he's doing nothing but lining his pockets. So it did create a huge pressure during the area of the cattle drives. And because of that, even though Baxter Springs was a booming community, the largest area in Cherokee County, by 1972, they had built a large building that they considered the courthouse, and it didn't become the courthouse. Cherokee County voted to not allow Baxter Springs to be the county seat, and that county seat went to the north central part of Cherokee County, and all because of Mr. Joy and his railroad and all of the hardships he created for the rest of the county. But with the cattle drives and many people flocking into the area, it was a boom town. We had multiple banks, multiple drug stores. There was 3 or 4 different blacksmiths, a tinsmith. The town was quite lucrative, and you saw that in the type of housing that came to the area. We've got several homes in the area that are on the state or the National Register of Historic Places because of all of this, creation of lucrative money coming through. First, Cowtown. Even though it wasn't a cow town for very long, it does hold the title here in Baxter Springs of being the first. With the cessation of the Civil War, with the ceding of the neutral lands, and the use of the military road, which was, like I said, was known as the Texas Road, was actually incorporated as part of the Eastern Shawnee Cattle Trail. It did make movement into this area quite common, because people have been utilizing this road for a number of years anyway. And you got to understand, many people didn't want to take these cattle into Missouri. Missouri didn't want them there because of the threat of tick fever. And, with the stockyards here and the large edge of the plains right here, it was a great place to bring the cattle in. There was abundant water, abundant grazing, and they could help the cattle recover from the long trail ride. And then, they could be herded on to Kansas City, Sedalia, and very quickly the trains came, which made it even easier to transport them. But that didn't last. Because of that threat of tick fever, the state of Kansas issued a law that said, Texas cattle can't come into Kansas anywhere east of the Arkansas River before November. And then we see Baxter Springs start to die off. It definitely died as a cattle town, and the town had to regroup. But because of that, we saw this huge growth in other parts of Kansas, as not only the Eastern Shawnee Cattle Trail was modified and to take cattle into other directions, but new trails were being utilized after the Eastern Shawnee was not as popular. So it was a great time to see how much growth through Kansas was because of the movement of cattle out of Texas. Some of the negatives that come through with southern Texas, you had all of the many rivers through southern Oklahoma to come through. Definitely rustlers who prowled through the Indian Territory. They, when you only had, U.S. Marshals in a certain areas, it was hard to keep law in the areas that were needed. And rustlers were at free will. Whole herds of cattle would disappear, or they would be picked off. And then the Native Americans who had different reservation lands crossing through those lands. Sometimes they allowed passage uninterrupted. Sometimes they did exact tolls, and these tolls came in the form of cattle. Many of these nations, were used to supporting themselves through the hunting of wild animals and, the bison especially. And all of a sudden they're on reservations and they're not allowed to continue their known way of life and their known food sources. So having these cattle supplement their nation as a food source was definitely something that the drovers knew was going to happen, and they planned for, some of these losses. May of 1870, John Joy's railroad came to town. They didn't have to go to Sedalia to market. They didn't have to go to Kansas City to herd these. They could bring them up here, graze them up, and let them recover from that trip, load them on the railroad, and off they went. And there were so many cattle shipped, but with the arrival of the railroad here, it also came to other parts of Kansas, and that really changed how cattle were shipped across Kansas. I mean, if you could herd them to Ark City or Wichita and put them on a train, and then within just hours they were in Kansas City or Sedalia, that was more profit for these drovers because, one, they sold their cattle quicker without having to herd them. And two, by putting them on the trains, they didn't lose as much weight from being trail driven. So, these extra trails, getting them to railroads and to market faster, really made a difference for the Texas drovers. So the murder of a marshal. This is a very sad story. In 1870, during part of the heyday of the cattle industry, as you can well imagine, with banks and druggists and different shops, also came houses of ill repute, came saloons, came boarding houses. There were numerous boarding houses and small restaurant type places where they could get meals. But Nellie Starr, and we don't know if that was her real name. or if she just assumed the name Starr because um, Henry Starr was a quite well known and notorious outlaw in the area. So, and many of these ladies of ill repute did take on assumed names. But she was uh, having a drink at the Wiggins house, and the Wiggins house later became the Springs Hotel. But she had been arrested many times by the marshal, and uh, so there was a dispute at the Wiggins house. Mr. Wiggins and Nellie Starr were arguing. A young cowboy got into the mix, and Marshal Seaman was trying to settle everybody down and stop the rowdiness, and guns were fired. Both Isham and Nellie had fired a weapon. Mr. Wiggins, the proprietor, was minorly wounded, but unfortunately, our marshal was shot and he died. Mr. Good was arrested and taken to Columbus, again, the county seat. He was released on bail, and he immediately mounted his horse and left. And further research shows that never to be seen again was the thought, but some newer research has that he actually went home, felt guilty, and reached out and made restitution to the family, which is a great ending to an unfortunate accident. Miss Nellie, on the other hand, she was charged many things. City ordinance charges, so she paid many fines, and she was right back to work within a day. So it just shows you how much that some of this rowdiness was everyday occurrences. Guns firing, people being shot. It was an everyday occurrence in such a booming town, with all of the drovers coming in, and just every day the population changed because of all these different people coming through the area. So a little bit about the museum. We are, it says a collaborative effort, and that is very much true. Our historical society has been an amazing tool for the city. These are volunteer members of the community. They are members of our historical society, and they worked very hard over the years to raise money and create not only the museum, but refurbish our visitor center. It's now on the National Register. The creation of the historic Fort Blair site. The current project is a new park that is on the north side of the visitor center to allow some parking in the downtown area, as well as some picnic tables and such. But the museum, we're a little over 20,000 square feet under roof at this time. And it started out with just one building. And as money was raised, a second building was created on the north side of that, and those two were attached. The original building opened in 79, the second building in 93. In 08, a west expansion building was added, and a solarium on the front room was added. And the solarium is a wonderful meeting place. It will hold approximately 90 people seated at tables. And if we just do like stadium seating with it will go push a little over 100. And it's just a fantastic place. We use it, weekly with different groups in the area. But with the 3 different buildings, with the expansion of all of these buildings, with the 20,000 square foot, it does make us a very, very large small town museum. Our running joke is that we are the largest small town museum that most people will ever see. And, with a town of a little over 4,000, to have a 20,000 square foot museum space is just crazy. And everybody loves it because each room is something different. We have our first room touches on the Civil War. The second room, we have Victorian furniture to World War II, vintage wedding dresses, millinery, which, you know, for those who don't know, millinery is hats and gloves, and, you know, sewing machines. Our third room on the main floor, we have an art gallery, a gallery dedicated to the Native American nations of the area, an African American gallery, which is very unique for the state of Kansas to have a small town museum that touches on the African American history of the area, the drovers, the Civil War soldiers. You know, Baxter Springs was, you know, we saw both the first Kansas colored volunteers were stationed here in the spring of '63. And in the fall of '63, when Quantrill attacked our fort site here, we saw the second Kansas colored volunteer. And that battle at the fort site in October of '63 is the first known instance of both black and white soldiers fighting shoulder to shoulder in a concerned effort to defend a fort site. So we saw two very unique moments with both those sets of soldiers here, and, you know, the Black history as it came through. After the cattle era died in Baxter Springs, many people picked up and moved to Joplin. They picked up to move to Galena. Joplin was a booming community that started after Baxter Springs did because of lead and zinc being found there and mining there. Galena by 1877 was the largest mining town in southeast Kansas. It was a boom community. And many people that had businesses here packed up and moved to those communities. And what you saw in many cases was literally they jacked the buildings up, put them on trucks, and, well, trucks by, you know, different ways to move things. You know, they would axles and wheels, and they would just literally roll them into a new community. In fact, the first hotel in Joplin was the Bateman House from here in Baxter Springs. And the Bateman House, when it was in Baxter Springs, would have been located on the southwest corner of 12th and Military, where our American Bank is now. And it was moved to Joplin, and it became the first hotel in Joplin. And it was just east of the viaduct on 2nd Street in Joplin, overlooking the hillside there. And it didn't last long. It went, you know, all wooden structure. It got burnt down. So, but it was known as the first hotel in Joplin. So we've got all of these history things, and there's so much of it here. But with the unique combination of the city owning the property as it was gifted by the Historical Society, and the Historical Society maintaining the day-to-day operations and the displays, it is such a great working combination between these two civic entities. So, and this building here is our visitor center located at 10th and Military. It is on the National Register of Historic Places. We stock it with gift shop items seasonally, and always travel information. If you're doing Route 66, you got to stop there. Get your pictures, get your travel information. We store travel information there for all states on Route 66, and it's a great place to, you know, just pause for a moment. Our historic fort, our Fort Blair Civil War site, again, that was a project by the Historical Society to reclaim the area where the fort was believed to be, because shortly after the battle in October of '63, the Union Army pulled back to Fort Scott, and when they did, they destroyed everything here. So if there was soldiers stationed here, it was an encampment area like it was before the fort was built. But they didn't want to leave anything that the Confederate Army or the irregulars and the bushwhackers could utilize, with the cabins that were there and such. So we do have a recreated fort site there every other year, so every odd year, coinciding with the anniversary of the Quantrill's attack there. So in the closest weekend to the first weekend in October, we host an encampment here, and we utilize the Fort Blair site. Our encampment guys love it because they come bursting out the door, firing their weapons. It's great. So Mickey Mantle. Most people are not aware that Mickey Mantle, who is also known as the Commerce Comet, he was born in Spavinaw, Oklahoma, and when he was a young lad of about 3, his family moved to Commerce, Oklahoma. His dad and his grandfather got jobs in the lead and zinc mines of the area, and he grew up around all of that mining. He grew up thinking he was going to be a miner. But when he was in high school, the Van Johnson League was in this area, and different communities had what we would classify as a travel team, a high school boys travel team. Now, it really wasn't quite that because they had their own league, their own teams, and he was part of the Baxter Springs Whiz Kids. And when he turned 18, scouts had been watching him and several other members on the team, and he signed his first contract with the New York Yankees in the park, which the park was on the west side of Spring River and 12th Street. And down here at what is now our Kiwanis Park, the ball field was there, and he was notorious for hitting home runs into Spring River from the ball field. But in the parking lot of that ball field, in the back of the Scouts car, he signed his first contract with the New York Yankees. He played a season with their minor league team in Independence. Then he went to Joplin again with their minor league team there. And then he went to Kansas City to the minor league team there. And while at Kansas City, he got into a slump, thought about coming home. And his dad went up and saw him and gave him a good dad's talking to. Basically said, figure it out or come home and get to work. And he figured it out, and they called him up, and the rest is, as they say, history. He, went on and played for the New York Yankees. Unfortunately, he did get hurt very early in his career with them, and he played the rest of his career in a lot of pain. But he held so much love for Baxter Springs with his coach from the Baxter Springs Whiz Kids and the friends that he had made playing on that team, that one of the first things that he was able to do was the New York Yankees were clearing out basically their equipment supplies, and all of their uniforms were being updated. And he was able to acquire all of these uniforms, hand-me-down Yankees uniforms, and he brought them home and he gave them to his coach, and they became Baxter Springs Whiz Kids uniforms. And, we had one on display. It was on loan from a local family, and it was their grandfather's, and they decided that they were going to pull it out before another family member might try to take it when it wasn't theirs. But because it just said their family, it was kind of open to anyone in the family. So they took it out so that they could allocate the different pieces of the uniform properly. But it was such a treat having a hand-me-down New York Yankees uniform in the museum. And, he was notorious for playing golf at the country club here and hanging out with these boys that he grew up with, and their kids were fans, and so he was a big part of the culture of the country club in Baxter Springs. We touch on a little bit here about our Baxter Springs Cowtown days. The first weekend in May, Friday and Saturday, each year annually, we do a big celebration. We host it mostly on the grounds next to the library at 10th and Park. And we have vendors, and we do, they do a Cowtown Idol, and there's a car show. Some years there's a chili cook-off, some years there's a barbecue cook-off. Just depends on which vendors pop up. And they do skits, and, with outlaws running through and guns blazing, and it's a lot of fun. And it's like most of your small town, annual event fairs. it celebrates the history of the area while bringing the community together to have a fun little celebration. And they've got big plans for this year. And this is some of our pictures from the past. Different cattle. We used to have a jail that we put up, and you had to buy a pass. And if you had your pass badge on, you couldn't be arrested by the marshals walking around the area. And if you were arrested, someone had to come bail you out and pay a fine. And so it was part of a fundraiser, and it was a lot of fun because you donated to the event one way or the other, which helped pay for different things coming in the following year. And we always have musicians who share their talent, and many of these are just local musicians that everybody knows and loves, and they just share their heart with the community. The museum hours. Now, the museum is open Tuesday through Saturday, 10 a.m. to 4:30, and on Sundays we're open 1 to 4. We do have a website, baxterspringsmuseum.org. We just updated that this year, and we really try to be open even in bad weather. But the rule of thumb is, because they don't want anyone getting hurt, is if our local school district is closed, Baxter schools are closed, the museum is closed. But this is, our general schedule. Now, our visitor center, it is open from the 1st of May. We try to open it to coincide with the weekend of Cowtown Days, to the first weekend in December, which is our annual Christmas parade. In fact, that is Christmas parade day. This first Saturday in December, you will see Christmas parades at Riverton, Baxter, Miami, Quapaw. Pitcher, Oklahoma has a huge annual celebration there. And we just all celebrate. The bands go from one school district to the next, and everybody comes out. So it's a day of parades. But that is when our visitor center is open daily, as volunteer staff is available from 10 to 4. So we try to keep it open most of the year, but with volunteer staff, all of you know how that goes. So that is the end of my slideshow. I'm going to close this. And I think that's it.
Outstanding, Mary. Thank you so much. You're getting thumbs up and rounds of applause.
Well, I know 45 minutes is a very short period to encapsulate how much history is here. So I was trying to push myself a little bit.
Well, you have a lot to share there. There are a couple of questions, and for those who are interested in receiving the Alcove Springs, I don't know if you can stop share, Mary.
Let's see.
I can stop it here, I think. There we go. For those who are interested in receiving the Alcove Springs newsletter, Dwayne has posted in the chat an email address for him. And Jean posted a question about the Hispanic drovers. What do we know about the vaqueros? Were they a presence in Baxter Springs? Do you know?
Well, of course they were, but it's not really talked about because not as much is known about them. You can't have drovers coming from Texas without having the presence of the vaquero, as well as the Negro. We black cattle drivers, they were very much employed. Latino, and having that heritage as you don't have a cowboy without the heritage of the Latino vaquero. There's just no escaping that. But what you saw was, and as we see in many places, it's just not talked about as much, and we don't have that in detailed history. Where you're going to see some details is when you see something sensational. So you got it in the early newspapers, like the marshal being shot, and Isham Good. And so you have these things, but you don't necessarily have the day-to-day without, say, sitting down through the city, which we do have a full collection of the early city books where they've arrested, fines are paid and such. So you don't have the day to day. And that's an unfortunate fact in many locations.
In many locations.
Because,
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's right.
minorities just did not receive the same storyline as white settlers did, unfortunately.
Unfortunately. There's another question here. Are there still the mystery lights at Baxter Springs? Dwayne, I have no idea what you might be
Okay, so
referring to there.
you are referring to the spook light. And the spook light was actually south of Baxter Springs in Oklahoma, in an area between Hornet, Peoria, and Quapaw. If you look on the Oklahoma map and find those three, in that area, the Hornet spook light was known. The Hornet spook light has been known well over 100 years. It's been tried to be played off as, balls floating out there, early headlights. But how can it be early headlights when the early Native Americans on reservations in this area have lore of it before there is headlights and such like that, So there's lore of it. My family, my dad's side of the family, has a history in the Hornet Seneca area, and my grandfather's farm, which is still in the family, they it was within a couple miles. It was seen of their house, and it was quite common when my great grandfather was a young man seeing it, and he was born in 1896. He had talked about it. So they're
There are
not seen as much.
UFOs. There are UFOs around Baxter Springs. Wow.
Well, it's actually in Oklahoma and a little bit of Missouri. They weren't
Okay.
actually seen in
Okay.
Baxter, but they
All
were
right.
south of here, and they were quite well known. And they have a rich history to the area of something unexplained. There have been numerous groups out there, paranormal groups trying to survey it, and they really can't get a read on it. And now, because of the spread of population, there's more lights out there. They're not seen. The last person that I spoke with that had seen them was about 15, 20 years ago, because of the extreme amount of light population out there. You can't see them as well.
Mary, there is a note from Gene Chavez, who's a noted historian. He says, I'd be happy to work with you to bring some of the Vaquero history to Baxter Springs. And there's an email address listed there, which we can provide and follow up to you.
That sounds wonderful, Gene. Thank you.
That's great, Gene. Any other questions? Folks, thanks. Another virtual round of applause, at least, for Mary Billington for a fascinating presentation today. Let's see, Lonnie, we're still working on our next Cattle Trails showcase. Is that right?
Yeah, I've got the subject matter picked, but I haven't found a presenter yet. And it kind of, we're taking a little different, but it has to do with a means of trade of money for the early settlers that had to do with buffalo bones. So if anybody knows an expert about buffalo bones, the one speaker I had has a conflict, so I'm still working trying to find the speaker on that subject.
In any event, we have that scheduled for Friday, March 14. So our usual schedule is the second Friday of each month is Cattle Trails Showcase. So be watching for more information about our presenter on that date and on future dates. We are going to have a discussion, I believe, with the Chisholm Trail Association board to follow. I'll stop the recording in a minute, but for now, until next time, this is Ron Wilson, Poet Laureate, saying thank you for taking time to join us in this place, and come on back next month for our Cattle Trails Showcase. Happy trails, everyone.